I'm currently teaching Basic Issues of Faith and Life, the required senior Bible course at Bethel College. We started out our semester reading Rob Bell's book, What is the Bible? How an ancient library of poems, letters, and stories can transform the way you think and feel about everything. The title alone sets the tone for what this book intends to do for readers. Bell's book creates an often new and exciting space to learn about and from an ancient book that people today have often walked away from because it's boring or confusing and contradictory, because of the violent stories scattered about its pages, or because it's been used to keep people on the outside of the church. Rob Bell, however, challenges his readers to grow in how they read the Bible, and that if they happen to find the Bible boring, well, then they aren't reading it correctly. This class of early 20-year-olds grasped onto this book in ways that I could have never expected while teaching my first college course. Common themes started rising up in our class discussions that centered around, why was I never taught this before? I always thought you could never question God or the Bible, or the Bible is what it is. This taught thought process from these emerging adults around God and religion is one of the reasons that I have seen people walk away from the church. There's not a place in the church to question why things are the way that they are, or to challenge the sacred cows that are not sacred to new generations of people who still desperately want to believe in and feel the presence of God in their lives. So when we moved to our second book, Searching for Sunday, Loving, Leaving, and Finding the Church by Rachel Held Evans, I began seeing new themes rise within our conversations together. Themes of, she's saying exactly what I've been thinking and feeling my whole life. And I'm glad to see and know that there are other Christians who are seeing and naming the contradictions found in religion. Rachel Held Evans, a lover of the Bible and Jesus, invites her readers to find and build faith communities where they belong as their true and full selves. And both of these books were written well before COVID swept through our congregations, closing our doors for months on end. And after opening back up, most churches have only reached 50 to 75% of the church attendance that they once had before COVID. And yet COVID is not what decreased church attendance. Churches did that on their own. COVID only allowed for an easier out for people who had already been wrestling with where they belong in their communities for many years. So now these people could quietly leave without judgment, without pushback, or without having to tell the church why they were truly leaving. Instead of tending to the fire that was the church for them, they could now tend to their own souls in ways the church was never able to for them. And this question of, where do I belong, is what Rahab brings to readers to wrestle with in Joshua 2. From the start of this story, readers are pointed to several identifying characteristics of Rahab. She is a prostitute, and she is a woman. An interesting piece that I find about this story is that in all of these verses in Joshua 2, no one else is named except Rahab, the woman prostitute, and Joshua. For writers of this time, this is unheard of because of the other books start off with long lines of male-only genealogy, or leave women unnamed, or name women through the men closest to them in family relation. These given identifiers of Rahab are supposed to be shameful. They are supposed to put her in her place. They name that she is a woman of lower status because she's a woman, and in an occupation of eyebrow-raising behavior that people in the community, however, still seek her out for. And in spite of these two human labels she was given, she was also given her name, Rahab. The name Rahab can be defined as proud one, which is an interesting comparison to her other seemingly shameful identifiers of a woman and prostitute. But I like to think that was the divine once again working in mysterious ways, letting readers and Rahab wrestle with the thought that maybe Rahab had nothing to be ashamed about at all. So as the story continues, we learn just how much of an outsider Rahab is to her community. Not only is she shamed for who she is as a person, but she also lives on the edge of her town, the edge of her community. Her house borders the wall of her city, and she lives alone in this house. So Rahab shelters these men, hides them and lies for them from the king who is looking for them. She tells them she knows that God is with them. And finally, she asks for protection for her and her family. We learn in this story that the very things that people have labeled Rahab with are what enable her to save her and her family. Because she is a woman, because she is a prostitute, because she lives alone, because she lives on the outskirts of town, she's able to save herself and her family. She's able to house these men without suspicion because of its location, and it's what she does for employment. She's able to talk with these men freely because there's no one else in her home. Her outsider-given identifiers enable her to be courageous for herself and her family. Her outsider-given identifiers are probably what also had instilled an unquestionable courage in her from an early age. She knew she had to make choices that went against the cultural norms in order to survive. One of the things that I try to teach my students is the importance of looking at these biblical stories from various sides in order to get a fuller picture of what could be going on at that time. So looking at Rahab from the eyes of the people about to be destroyed in a genocide in Jericho, one could also portray her as a villain or a traitor in this story, because she's the person who betrayed her community. She allowed these spies access to her community, and as a result, it was burned to the ground. However, I think that Rahab didn't have any other choice because of her place in her community. But she did want to survive. She chose in this moment to live into her courageous identity as an outsider and survive. Now, the genocide of the people of Jericho is a terrible story, and a whole sermon series could be devoted to it in order to analyze this part of the story. And it's not Rahab's fault. Saying that it is would once again blame women for all of the sin in the world because of an apple, or shame women for their occupation they may have been forced into in order to survive, or shame people for leaving their church communities when they have been shown year after year that they don't matter. We tend to put blame on the outsiders for being outsiders when it's not their fault. Systems have forced them into situations outside of their control where they are required to make difficult decisions in order to survive. For Rahab, her choice was to die in a burning city with her community who had pushed her out because of who she was, or to shelter these spies and in return survive, possibly finding a new community she could belong in and be shown love. Rahab knew who she was, and she was not ashamed of it. She lived into her name and was proud of who she was. But she also desperately wanted a community. The church, and specifically the Mennonite church, because that's the group of people who I come from, have done a really good job at creating insider groups where people like Rahab don't belong. We do this by playing the Mennonite game, by putting in more resources to supporting Ukrainian refugees than we ever did with the Afghani refugees next door in Wichita. And we do this by being comfortable in our churches. Now, there's lots of reasons why people have left the church. But the most common one that I personally have heard, especially from young adults, is that they are seeking an inclusive community that is safe and where they feel like they can belong. They want to be able to ask the hard faith questions with their church community, but they also feel like their questions are taboo. One of the things that was monumental for my own faith journey was being part of a church community as a youth that not only knew my name, but knew what I did in my free time, showed up to my extracurricular activities, let me ask all of my faith questions, and engaged me and my gifts in the church walls weekly. It wasn't just the pastor. She was my mom. She was required to. And it wasn't just the Sunday school teachers or the youth leaders. It was every single person in that church. To be known and seen for who you are makes a huge difference in the life of a youth who is beginning to live into who she is as a person. Young adults are on fire. They have passions that they chase after and questions they want to investigate. They're not yet afraid to speak their truths to whoever will listen. But after years of noticing when communities don't also support their passions, or more often support them in superficial ways, these young adults get burned and they leave and find communities who actually have shared values outside of the church. Like Rahab, people leaving the church seemingly only have two options: to stay and assimilate to a culture they had no part in building and no place to be who they are, or leave and find a community with shared values and beliefs. It's easy to find that in college or in shared housing situations. It's a lot harder to find that in churches filled with established small groups and Sunday school classes and committees that one has to figure out how they fit into. The church has continually, however, been called to make space for those lingering on the outside. And the difficulty with this task is that it requires people on the inside to put aside what might make this community comfortable for them and listen to what others might find more life-giving. It requires people on the inside to set aside some of their passions in order to make space for new passions to blossom. It requires people on the inside to do the hard work of going outside of their normal circles and getting to know others. The people on the inside are the ones who have to do this hard work. So my challenge for you, for us, is to be curious, to those on the margins of our communities, to wonder what walls might be in place that exclude the Rahabs around you, and to be flexible to how others are welcomed and celebrated and seen in this space. Doing these things might mean that the church looks vastly different moving forward. But it could also bring the church into a new territory of radically following Jesus. It could also create spaces for the outsiders and the Rahabs and the people who are leaving communities to find a place at God's table where they belong. Because at the end of the day, is church meant to make us comfortable, or is it meant to live out God's love for the world?